Buradan da ekrandan görebileceksiniz. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Ooh, this is a bit. I'll put this away slightly. Welcome to our speaker series here at Georgetown University. On behalf of the Institute of Turkish Studies, my name is Sinan Ciddi. I am the Executive Director of the Institute. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome our next speaker in our program, Professor Nil Shetana. And if I may just give you a brief background of her credentials, so you know where she's from. She's very generous. She's generously given up her time to be with us today, given her very busy schedule. So let me just give you a brief rundown. Professor Shetana is an assistant professor of international relations at Bilkent University in Ankara, specializing in comparative politics, international relations, research methods, and Middle Eastern politics. Her research interests include democratization and civil-military relations, international civil-ethnic conflicts, third-party interventions, religious fundamentalism, and terrorism. Currently, she is a research associate at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism Center at the University of Maryland, working on a Department of Homeland Security-funded project on religious extremism and terrorism. In addition, she is also working on 2 books, one on civil-military relations in Turkey and the Middle East, and another on international interventions in the Kurdish question in Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. Professor Shetana has published in peer-reviewed journals such as Comparative Political Studies, Armed Forces and Society, Terrorism and Political Violence, and Turkey Studies. So I will pass the floor on to you now, and it's all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sinan. You spoiled me. This is, as a result, going to be a nicer presentation for you all. Thank you for giving up your lunchtime for me. It's not going to be as good as lunch, but hopefully it will satisfy anyone who's interested in a bunch of things. This project that I'm working on right now is for a special issue of the journal, and I'm trying to bring a lot of things together. And usually you don't want to study all these things together, but the interesting about terrorism and democracy and civil-military relations is no one has actually looked at how these 3 really interact with one another, especially for the cases that I'm looking at. There have been a lot of non-academic work and some academic work on terrorism and democracy, but you know, the angle that I'm going to be taking for this project is going to be a little different than what's out there. So I have actually studied civil conflict for many years, and I have done field research in Iraq and Syria and Turkey in the early to mid 2000s. And one thing that I always was interested in was that terrorism has always been together with any kind of war, especially in the last few decades. So one of the first things that I want to discuss is
Oh, I will just use the keyboard key, sorry.
All
The
right.
battery may be dead.
I'm more comfortable with the keyboard anyway.
How's that? It works.
I'm not very happy.
Sorry about that.
So what is terrorism anyways? Terrorism, according to the center the START center that I'm working at right now, is the threatened or actual use of illegal force and violence. So it needs to be illegal. It needs to be violent by an armed state actor, which makes this a new kind of threat for the world. And to attain a political, economic, religious, or social goal, there has to be a goal more than just a personal goal. So, it's done, terrorist acts are carried out because they want to reach wide audiences, and they want to scare these wide audiences, and they want to coerce and intimidate the wide audiences so that the governments will be forced to change policy or to converge with the policies that the terrorist organization wants. So wide audience, act has to be against international humanitarian law. There are so many different definitions of terrorism out there. So because there are so many definitions, Start Center decided to keep the definition larger than it did in the past, which was just this in the past, and added the wide audience and the against international humanitarian law clauses to its definition. In other words, terrorism is a brutal act, right? So terrorism is a brutal act, no matter if it is domestic terrorism or transnational, international terrorism. And most of the time, my experience is that there is not a clear distinction between domestic and transnational terrorism. So this project that I'm going to tell you about today is interested in both domestic and transnational terrorism, like I said, because of all the inherent ties between domestic and transnational terrorism. And what is democracy? Here's another crazy concept that you find several different definitions, and no one seemed to be agreeing on what democracy is. So I'm actually tackling with these really hard definitions, and I stick with the definitions that seem to be addressing most of our concerns. For democracy, I am going to...
Window button is on there.
Which one?
Window button. No, no.
How about escape? How about I escape? All right. All right. That's something I'm good at. Polity4 project is looking at, again, centered in University of Maryland, is looking at what democracy is and what really makes democracy something that we would all like to achieve. And it really is conceived as three essential and interrelated, interdependent elements. And the presence of, the first one is the presence of institutions and procedures through which citizens can express effective preferences. What this is trying to get at is free and fair elections. But the issue is, once you have free and fair elections, are you a democratic country? This is what has been discussed a lot in this literature. No, you just become a formal democracy, and you do not become a liberal democracy when you have free and fair elections. So what else do you need? You need the existence of institutional constraints on the executive. You don't want the executive to be too strong. So what do you have to eliminate that possibility? You have the courts. You have institutions such as the Supreme Court in almost all liberal democracies. And is that enough? Well, the third element actually makes the definition of democracy more of a liberal democracy. And the third element is civil rights. So do you have freedom of association? Do you have freedom of speech? So are your civil rights guaranteed in the law? And can you actually lead your everyday life without the fear of persecution, without reasonable evidence? So these three things, according to Polity4 data or the project, are three things that make a democracy a liberal democracy. And that's how I also think of democracy. You can add several other elements to this, but I think at minimum, these are the elements that we would like to have in any liberal democracy. And okay, it's going to happen. If there was a mouse, that would be, oh, there it is. All right. I gave you the definitions of terrorism, democracy, fine. What is the puzzle? What am I really trying to get at this project? My puzzle is, it looks like everyone is extremely concerned about terrorism. The literature on terrorism treats terrorism as the main problematic. You know, it is the dependent variable. It is what we really have to be concerned about. So there is a large literature on root causes of terrorism. And as much as I criticize this literature for focusing too much on terrorism as the problematic, I also work within that framework as well. Like Sinan said, I'm looking at how religious fundamentalism affects terrorism. So religion is shown to be one of the causes of terrorism. Poverty or GDP of a country is shown to be individual and national level poverty seems to be shown as a good reason for terrorism, especially World Bank. Scholars study on that. Education seems to be one of the factors that is looked at. Psychology of the terrorist, or there's a whole political psychology literature that looks at the psychology of the terrorist and doing profiling studies. Just as profiling of Hitler was done, now we're looking at the profiles of well-known terrorists, and we're trying to understand the minds of the terrorists. And economy and finally democracy is shown to be a factor affecting terrorism. There's literature that says democracies attract more terrorist attacks, so they're more vulnerable to terrorist attacks. And there are studies that say mixed results, right, as always. There are studies that say, well, if you have a more inclusive democracy, then you're going to have fewer terrorist attacks. So you're not going to be making as many people unhappy in an inclusive democracy. So we see terrorism studied as the main problematic. And as far as counterterrorism studies go, there's a lot on military operations, and there's a lot on how force is used or how force can be effectively used for counterterrorism. And there is limited knowledge for how other alternative methods, whether alternative methods exist for counterterrorism as counterterrorism measures. And this has bugged me for a long time until I started this project. And the more I read and the more I thought about this, I started thinking, okay, maybe we are omitting a really important actor here, which seems to be forgotten, especially in Western democracies, the military. Now, as a Turkish person, I'm very much familiar with the military and how military is related to democracy. But most Western democracies have come to the conclusion that civilian control has taken place in Western democracies, and that was by default the conceptualization of civil-military relations in Western democracies. And I kept thinking maybe terrorism has a different effect on, terrorism has a debilitating effect on democracy in Western advanced democracies as well, because it transforms civil-military relations in Western countries. And this is where I start thinking, okay, the democracy should be really the problematic, because the way the military affects the society and the civilian politics is going to be extremely important for democratic practices. So one thing that really bugged me is why are we so afraid of terrorism or apprehensive of terrorism as opposed to other methods of people killing each other? Because we seem to react to terrorism in a different way than we seem to react to civil wars or international wars or even genocides that have taken place in the world. So terrorism has become this issue that we have been dealing with, but I believed in not exactly the right way. So I decided that, well, we're scared of terrorism because it's a tactic that can be used in every war. So civil, international, doesn't matter. It's a tactic that we human beings use in any type of conflict. And it has become more and more common. That's why we're so apprehensive of it. We don't know the perpetrator. You know, if we're in a war, we know who the enemy is. So, you know, we feel better when we know who we are killing or who we are being killed by. But with terrorism, we just don't know. And we don't really know why they're killing us. So in the Cold War era and before that, the logic was that the enemy was there and you knew that there was an ideological or territorial cause of war, and we felt more comfortable with that as opposed to terrorism. And that's what our international law also tackled, lagging behind several decades, even in war. So with terrorism, we're just scared of losing our way of life. And this is something that you've probably heard from politicians a lot, way of life. Well, by way of life, I think we all mean that we are afraid of losing democracy. We're afraid of losing the privileges of living in a democracy. And so my research question has become, how does terrorism affect the quality of democracy in developing and advanced democracies alike, such as the United States and Turkey? I'll tell you why US and Turkey later. But the question has been interesting to me because I have already been studying civil-military relations for several years now. And I've always thought that the military is an important actor in the case of Turkey and in the case of Middle Eastern countries and some Asian countries. Military has been a major actor. And I also kept thinking, well, although Western democracies believe that they are safe with civil-military relations, there has been literature on problems with the military because there has been an ongoing gap between the civilians and the military because of the military way of life, you know, the more isolated military way of life. So I kept thinking that civil-military relations is an intervening variable in the relationship between terrorism and democracy. What I mean by that is terrorism affects the military and affects the civilians, and as a result, democratic practices suffer from it. And how do I think about this? How do I conceptualize this? Well, first of all, by the end of 1990s, before 9/11, most scholars were very hopeful about civil-military relations and about democracy and everything. And the U.S. was seen to be the victorious party in the Cold War, and that actually, you know, led to a really hopeful academic and otherwise scholarship. And in 1999, Douglas Bland wrote, "Now is the time to come up with a unified theory and a set of predetermined laws, norms, principles are agreed upon between the civilians and the military." So these sets of principles, this is kind of, you must be familiar with Joseph Nye and the whole regime theory where, you know, principles, norms, they all actually lead to less conflictual relations in the world. Well, a similar reasoning was used here by Bland, and he believed that there is this regime established in civil-military relations in democracies where the civilians and the militaries have a common understanding of one another and how things work and where the limits are, where the boundaries are. At the time, after 9/11, Peter Feaver, who writes extensively on civil-military relations and international relations, he argued that, well, when there is a convergence of preferences between the civilians and the military, there is going to be peaceful civil-military relations. So the civilians and the military will only have good relations, peaceful relations, when they wanted the same thing. Or at least they could agree on most of the things that they wanted. And divergence of preferences was going to lead to conflict. Now, one of the things that he tackled a lot was use of force. So apparently, civilians become hawks when there is a need to use force, and militaries are usually more mild when it comes to the use of force. So the militaries are not, you would think that the military wants to go fight right away, right? No, the empirics tell us that the military is usually reluctant to go ahead and fight. In most situations, they want more thorough planning, but when they do actually decide to go fight, they want to do it with full force. While the civilians would like to send forces right away, but mildly, so they would like to show force, and the military is not really that appreciative of that. In the US example, Colin Powell doctrine basically summarizes it. He was not happy with mild use of force or frequent use of force, and he believed that you need to, go full force if you are going to use force. So use of force, in other words, has been a really important point of convergence or divergence between the civilians and the military for a very long time, and in all democracies. So I argue in this project that terrorism permanently changes the regime that Blend is talking about, and it actually makes the use of force a hotly debatable topic that Peter Fever is talking about. So regardless of convergence or divergence of preferences of the civilians and the military, I believe that terrorism leads to a weakening of civilian control of the military. And when there is a weakening in civilian control of the military, you're going to have, sooner or later, you're going to have a change in laws and practices, which is going to affect democracy. So I'm going to get into more detail with this because I think, I'm asking why does terrorism strengthen the military vis-a-vis the civilians? It looked like, in the US case, it looked like Bush administration was really strong, right? So the civilians were really strong. Well, I'm not arguing that the civilians become weak. I'm arguing that the military becomes stronger than it was, or more powerful politically than it was. So it's not really civilians becoming weak and military becoming more powerful. It's more like military becoming more powerful regardless of what's going on in the civilian domain. And this is something, this whole thing actually made me read some interesting interdisciplinary stuff, and I recommend it so much because I have never had, I've never looked at criminologists' take on terrorism. And when I did that, works of Gary Lafree and other criminologists show that the whole situation with terrorism has led to portrayal of terrorism as a war in the United States and in many other places. Well, the focus of the criminologists in this country is on the United States, but this actually applies to several other cases. So terrorism has become the new drug war or the new war against crime in the United States, and war on terror has become the third war as a result from a criminologist perspective. Interestingly, international relations scholars, hardly ever look at the criminologist perspective and vice versa. And the international relations scholars, especially from Copenhagen School in Europe, like Barry Buzyn, Olive Weber, they actually talk about securitization. And this is a concept, an interesting concept, that I decided to use. You know why? Because securitization means to make a threat, any sort of threat, and make it into an existential threat. So once you securitize any issue, it suddenly becomes a matter of death or life to deal with that threat. And you know what? That changes how you deal with that threat. So in the study, I am reconciling these concepts. What happens when you securitize terrorism? And what happens when you make it to the extreme? You securitize in such extremes that you're portraying any terrorist attack as a war, as an act of war. Okay? So an act of war is different than just an ordinary terrorist act. And the interesting thing here is the willingness of us, the civilians, to portray terrorist attacks as war. Because that is exactly what happened in the US, and that is what happened in several instances in Western democracies. So the civilians, like I said, are eager to dramatize things and portray things as war or securitize things, which actually starts a chain of events. One of the first things that happens is armed forces start getting used in homeland security. So while the armed forces, the military, is prepared to deal with external threats and to fight outside the borders of their country, they are not equipped or prepared to fight inside. Well, they're very efficient. They can quickly organize for themselves for homeland security, but that is not why we have armed forces. But in this chain of events, when any terrorist attack is securitized or it is portrayed as war, what we see, the first thing that we see, is use of the military in homeland security. And to change laws to make this possible. Okay? And the second thing that we see, well, I guess it's not in this given order. I haven't thought much about the order of things. But another thing that I observe is militarization is sooner or later going to take place if you start using the military at home and abroad. So the more you use the military, the more the country is going to militarize. So more weapons will be bought, and there will be the use of weapons will increase. Weapons industry is going to prosper from it and will support more militarization. So what we call, a cycle of militarization is going to take place as a result of using the military more than it is intended to be used. And militarization is going to and the constant emphasis on how we are under constant threat or existential threat, terrorist threat, is going to lead to more funding for the military. And that sounds problematic to me, because the more funding the military has, the more weapons, or the weapons industry is going to be strengthened, and as a result, you do not like to give up a right that you were given legally within the legal system when that threat disappears in the past. So one problem with securitization is it's really difficult to desecuritize the issue. And it's really very difficult to take back all the things that you did, all the changes that you have done to the system. And so, you just can't take the funding back. And when you do, it will be harshly protested. We've seen this in the US, we've seen this in the Turkey example as well. I'll get to it. Another unexpected consequence is that the military and the society will get closer. You know why? One great reason for that is the military is going to become more visible. In a country where securitization of terrorism is experienced, the military will be more visible and in more heroic ways. Is there anything wrong with that? No. The military is supposed to be heroic. So the military is supposed to be visible. But for external threats or international wars, that is. So the problem with terrorism is there is an overstimulation of the citizens' fear of terrorism because we don't know the perpetrator, because the civilians are getting killed in terrorist attacks. So the whole dynamics between the military and the society changes as a result. And you know why that is a problem? Because militarism as an ideology is an ideology that all Western democracies are trying to avoid. Because militarism, we have seen in the case of Second World War and pre-Second World War Germany, militarism is going to lead to dictatorial tendencies. And militarization and militarism are two different things. What I'm trying to say here is the chain of events, increasing militarization, purchase of weapons, use of weapons, normalization of use of weapons is going to sooner or later affect the relations between the military and the society. And the closer the military and the society get, the more the society is going to normalize militaristic values. And why is this a problem? Well, the first rule of healthy civil-military relations is the military cannot be politicized. So the military has to stay out of political decisions. The military can function as expert opinion in defense matters, security-related matters, but the military has to stay out of politics. Now, the problem here in this chain of events is the military cannot stay out of politics once it's used in homeland security. Because the impression that the military starts getting in this situation is the civilians cannot handle this situation with their ordinary security forces, and that's why they're recruiting us to take care of this issue. And they are portraying the whole issue as a war. You know what? A military is trained not to lose wars. Sometimes they lose wars, but they're trained not to lose wars. So once the military is in it, in homeland security, it's in it. And that actually will lead to politicization of the military. The military partisanship is going to increase. And I'm going to tell you in a minute that in the United States that actually did happen since 9/11 attacks and since the use of the military in homeland security. And, you know, to sum it all up, Daesh once said, indeterminate structural environments causes problems for civil-military relations. And it not only causes problems for civil-military relations, the problem is very much there for democracy, because healthy civil-military relations is necessary for democracy for democratic practices to continue, or for democracy to be consolidated in a developing democracy. So this is the whole theoretical framework that I am right now trying to develop, and please feel free to contribute to it. So far, I thought it's really interesting that that we mostly dealt with terrorism with military tactics and with military approaches. And it amazed me to read the criminologists' take on it, because they argue that when you treat something as a war, you are doomed to fail, because wars usually are supported in the short term. And if you can't win the war, then, you know, you're done. So you are actually losing prestige, and you're just failing as a politician and as the military. So knowing that portraying something as war is a bad idea, it's done. It's used many times in all these cases that I've looked at. It's amazing. It's like we're not learning. And I thought it would be interesting to set up a what Przeworski and Toon would call a most different systems design, which means look at two really very different countries, and in several ways, and see if they have the same factor and the same consequence. Okay, so they both have terrorism, they both deal with terrorism, and they both have a decline in democracy, or the quality of democracy. That was the criteria that I thought I would use, or the setup, the design that I would use in this study. And I think US and Turkey are very different in many, many ways, but it looks like they're, the way they securitize the issue of terrorism and the way they deal with terrorism are quite similar. So they are quite comparable cases. In Turkey, you're probably familiar with this, but just some background information. PKK terrorism since 1980s. And since the first attack in mid-1980s, more than 40,000 people killed in terrorist, in the fight against PKK, I should say, the attacks. Several other consequences. Hundreds of villages evacuated. So in the southeast, migration to larger cities. The size of cities like Diyarbakir and Istanbul doubled, tripled as a result of PKK terrorism, or as a result of the counterterrorism measures that were used against PKK terrorism. And there is a securitization of terrorism for decades. And this is actually quite interesting because I actually previously wrote on this. The Kurdish issue and PKK terrorism have been separated in state discourse in such a way that it was almost rewarding to securitize the PKK terrorism. And that way, the more securitized PKK terrorism was, the less the state had to deal with the Kurdish issue. So when you just push the issue as a security issue as opposed to a political issue, or as opposed to a rights issue, then you are able to do whatever you want with the military. So the approach in the Turkish case was military operations, and as a result, we see weak civilian control, more and more powerful military for several decades, and the toll on democracy was really harsh. Democratic practices was very harsh. In the U.S. case, this is a different kind of democracy. It is accepted as an advanced democracy, while Turkey is a developing democracy. The U.S. had to deal with global transnational terrorism. I'm only going to focus on this. The U.S. has to deal with homegrown terrorism or domestic terrorism as well. But for this study, I'm focusing on, global transnational terrorism, and especially Al-Qaeda attacks. And the first Al-Qaeda attacks, to the best of our knowledge, is 1992, which took place in Yemen. And I actually think that the attacks that took place outside the United States affect the U.S. as much as the attacks that took place in the United States. So I don't distinguish between the location of attacks. High death toll, we all know about 9/11 death toll, right? We don't really know much about how many other American citizens, embassy workers, and military died in terrorist attacks from Al-Qaeda. So the number is high. And the interesting about the United States is the issue is first dealt within the criminal justice system. And it did not have much of an effect on civil-military relations in the 1990s. So what I want to do with this study is look at different decades. What happened in Turkey in 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, and what happened in the US in 1990s and 2000s. So it looks like, there is a difference in tactics between the 1990s and 2000s for the United States. And after the 9/11 attacks, once there was a portrayal of the attacks as a war, the issue was securitized and the approach changed from a criminal justice approach to a military approach for the first time. Then weaker civilian control took place, and that took a toll on democracy. So I'm comparing these two cases that are so different in so many other factors, but quite similar in how the issue of terrorism is securitized and how democracy was hurt as a result. The Turkish case. Of course, the Turkish case is a case that I know better than the US case, but I'm getting there with the US case as well. And for the Turkish case, I find that I asked the question of how the Turkish state securitized terrorism. How do you do that? And how do you justify it? And especially in the case of the Kurdish issue, how can you so successfully build a policy to completely avoid the Kurdish issue and to emphasize on the terrorism and securitize terrorism? One question that you might ask is, isn't terrorism a security issue anyways? Yes, it is. But securitization, the concept of securitization means to make a security or political or economic or social issue and to make it into an existential threat. So we're not talking about, just an ordinary security issue being used as a security issue. We're talking about making a threat and magnifying it and making it an existential threat and asking for immediate and emergency measures to be taken to deal with that issue. That's what I mean by securitization. Okay? That's why that concept is really important for me. I'm not just talking about, hey, terrorism is already a security issue. Of course it's used as a security issue. I'm talking about magnifying it, getting it out of proportion, and making it a threat that you have to deal with immediately and with emergency measures. So how did that change? Doing that, how did that change the perceptions of the society, of the civilian politicians, and of the military itself? Okay? So my assumption here is all these actors change, and they change together. They are interdependent on each other, and they change together. So as a consequence, how did terrorism affect Turkey and Turkey's democratization? I would say that Turkey is one of the countries that have stalled its democracy for a very long time, compared to countries such as Spain and Greece, where there have been civil wars, there have been repression, and more violence than in the Turkish case. But they seem to do better with their, relatively better with their democracies than Turkey has been doing. So it's almost like we're frozen in this transition phase, and we just can't complete our consolidation phase. And that has been bothering me for over a decade right now. So I think that terrorism and the way terrorism affects civil-military relations is the answer to that question. Why are we frozen in time? Well, there you go. I'm tracing the development from 1980s to 1990s and 2000s. And in the 1980s, when the first attack took place, Turgut Özal, the prime minister of the time, said, "Oh, these are just a few plunders, so it's no big deal." And he was actually not even thinking of this or conceptualizing the threat as a serious threat, not even as a much of a security issue. So at first, in the very beginning, this was right after 1980 coup, and there was 1983 elections, and people were more hopeful about transitioning to democracy. Özal was not as strong as he was going to be later on, but he was strong because he was victorious in the elections that the military thought that a party close to the military would win the elections. So Özal had lots of confidence at the time as a civilian. It is really sad that confidence is going to erode in civilian politicians in Turkey in time. And part of it is definitely related to terrorism. So a few plunderers later on, after the civilians were attacked and villages were attacked and children were killed, has become, oh, we have to do something about this. And the approach, the immediate approach, was a military approach, because the military was, it already intervened in the country politics for 3 times up until then, and they were strong, they were prepared, they were efficient, they never lost a war, so they were prestigious in the society. So there was definitely a military approach that took place, and Özal was fine with that. And what happened as a result? We had the village guard system, which basically meant hiring some Kurdish villagers and arming them and having them fight against the PKK terrorists. And at the time, the PKK terrorists were coming to villages, visiting villages, asking for food, and soon after decided to tax the villagers who were already being taxed by the state. And after the whole village guard system took place, we started seeing PKK this time to kidnap villagers and recruit them as soldiers. So the military approach of the state was immediately reciprocated by the PKK, and a whole militarization cycle started right there. An emergency rule was declared in the southeast in several countries, and that actually stayed intact for a very long time. And cross-border operations to Iraq started with an agreement with Saddam, after an agreement with Saddam. So there was permission from Saddam at first to get in Iraq and bomb the safe havens of the PKK terrorists. So all of this that I'm trying to exemplify showed that military approach was accepted and put forth by the civilians and the military. And for a while, both the civilians and the military thought they were in control of things. The attacks only went worse and worse. And the interesting thing is, when you research the papers from the 1980s, and I did that for Milliyet paper, because they have archives going until like 1950. So there's no public debate, really, on PKK terrorism. There's no public debate on the Kurdish issue either, but there are so many people dying in villages, and there's all these precautions, and there's just no public debate. Part of it is that the media was controlled by the military, so there couldn't be really a public debate. And part of it is because the public actually believed that this was the way to go. Most people, just the society, depended on the military to handle affairs, and that was the way to go. As a result, the military and the civilians converged in the policy of use of force, which actually strengthened the military. the more the military used force, the more their political power increased in Turkey in the 1980s, and it limited democracy. Well, okay, I wouldn't expect a flourishing democracy right after a coup anyways, right? What happens in the 1990s? Does the situation change in the 1990s? It actually gets worse in the 1990s. The threat perception, which was, external threat, which is basically Greece, in the military's understanding, changed to internal threat perceptions. PKK was one, Islamism was the other internal threat perception, and PKK in the 1990s, I would say, has become, in the first part of 1990s, PKK threat has become more important than any other security issue, more than Islamism. And the military approach, once again, was used by both the civilians and the military. And the number of military personnel increased drastically. I'm talking about drastic change. Turkish